Hey guys, tonight we are slipping into the gaslit shadows of Victorian London, into a world where silk top hats brushed against grimy cobblestones, where gentlemen in morning coats paid for pleasures they would never acknowledge in daylight, and where survival meant selling the one thing polite society pretended did not exist. Forget the Jane Austen drawing rooms and the stiff upper lips. We are talking about the men who lurked in the arcades of Piccadilly, who worked the urinals beneath Leicester Square, who knew every dark corner of the West End where a transaction could happen fast enough to avoid the police. Men who were called rent boys, Mary Anns, and sodomites. Men whose stories Victorian England tried very hard to erase. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you are tuning in from and what time it is for you. It is always fascinating to see who is joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let us ease into tonight's journey together. But seriously, have you ever wondered what it was like to sell sex in an era that made your very existence a criminal act? How did gay male prostitutes find clients in a city that hanged men for sodomy? Where exactly did these transactions happen when hotel clerks, landladies, and beat cops were everywhere? What was the going rate for your services when your customers could not exactly advertise their needs in the Times? How did you avoid the undercover police who posed as clients just to arrest you? Did you have regulars, or was every night a gamble? And what is the Victorian equivalent of swiping right? A strategically placed handkerchief and prolonged eye contact in a public toilet. Congratulations, you have just arrived in London sometime around 1885. You are 17, maybe 20, and you work the streets. Let us see if you can survive without ending up in prison, dead, or shipped to Australia. Good luck. You wake up in a rented room that smells like damp wallpaper and yesterday's cabbage. The room is not much. A narrow bed with a horsehair mattress that pokes through the ticking, a washstand with a chipped basin, a single chair, and wallpaper so faded you cannot tell if the pattern was once flowers or just mold pretending to be decorative. You share this building with factory workers, laundresses, seamstresses, and at least 3 other men doing exactly what you do. The landlady knows, everyone knows, but as long as you pay your rent on time and do not bring trouble to her doorstep, she asks no questions. You cannot bring clients here. That is the rule. Most landladies will not tolerate it. Too risky. The police raid brothels, and while male prostitution does not operate in formal brothels the way women's does, the threat is always there. One nosy neighbour, one angry client, one wrong move, and suddenly you are explaining yourself to a magistrate. So you work elsewhere. You work outside. You work in the places Victorian London built for other purposes, but which, after dark, transform into something else entirely. It is evening now, maybe 6 o'clock. You have not eaten much today. A penny bun this morning, weak tea. You need money. Rent is due in 3 days and winter is coming, which means you need a heavier coat if you plan to keep working outside through November. So you wash your face in cold water from the basin, slick your hair back with a bit of pomade you stole from a client 2 weeks ago, and check your reflection in the small cracked mirror above the washstand. You look young. That helps. Victorian gentlemen who pay for men usually want youth, smooth faces, slim builds, the kind of boy who could still pass for 16 even if you are 23. If you are lucky enough to have delicate features, fine bone structure, anything that reads as feminine or androgynous, you can charge more. The clients call you things like pretty and sweet, even as they are doing things to you that are anything but. You adjust your collar, check your teeth. You head out into the London night, where the fog is already rolling in, thick and yellow-grey, smelling of coal smoke and the Thames. Gaslight flickers through the mist. Boots echo on wet pavement. Somewhere a piano is playing in a pub, badly. You walk west, toward Piccadilly, toward the West End, where the money is. Let us talk about where you work, because Victorian London had an entire invisible geography of gay male prostitution, a secret map that every man in the trade knew by heart. The casual observer saw only elegant arcades, bustling streets, public conveniences. You saw opportunity. You saw danger. You saw the narrow spaces between respectability and ruin. Piccadilly Circus was the centre of it all. By the 1880s, this area had become the most notorious cruising ground in London for men seeking men. The arcades, covered shopping passages with glass roofs and tiled floors, were perfect. You could loiter without seeming suspicious. You could window shop. You could shelter from the rain. And you could make eye contact with gentlemen who slowed their pace when they saw you, who glanced back over their shoulder, who lingered near the same shop window just a bit too long. The Burlington Arcade, the Royal Opera Arcade. These were high-end hunting grounds. Gentlemen in evening dress heading to the theatre or the club, army officers in uniform, businessmen, lawyers, politicians, men with money, men with reputations to protect, men who could not risk being seen entering a molly house or responding to some coded newspaper ad. They wanted discretion. They wanted speed. They wanted someone young and desperate enough not to ask questions. You would walk slowly through the arcade, hands in pockets. You would catch a man's eye and hold it just a fraction too long. If he looked away quickly, he was not interested or too frightened. If he looked back, you had him. The next step was subtle. A nod toward the exit, a slight tilt of the head, sometimes a murmured word as you passed. Looking for company? Or even simpler, sir. One word was often enough. If he followed you out of the arcade, the negotiation happened fast. Price, location, services. You learned to read men quickly. The nervous ones, first-timers, would pay more because they did not know the going rate. The experienced ones would name a price and expect you to take it or walk. You learned which ones were dangerous, which ones were vice officers, which ones might turn violent once they were finished with you. Most transactions happened for between 2 shillings and 5 shillings. That does not sound like much, but context matters. A working-class labourer might earn 15 shillings a week. A housemaid earned even less. You could make 5 shillings in 20 minutes if you found the right client and knew where to take him. Do that twice a night, and you were earning more than most factory workers, even if the work left you cold and sore and trying not to think too hard about what you had just done. The public lavatories were the other key location. Victorian London had just started installing underground public conveniences, these beautiful tiled subterranean spaces meant to be a triumph of modern sanitation. What the city planners did not anticipate was that they also became perfect meeting places for illegal sex. The conveniences beneath Leicester Square, Charing Cross, and Regent Street all developed reputations. Men would descend the steps, supposedly to relieve themselves, and find an entire hidden world. You would stand at the urinal longer than necessary. Wait. A man would enter. He would glance at you. If he was interested, he might move to the urinal beside yours, even though others were free. The better-designed conveniences had private stalls with doors that locked. If you were bold and the attendant was looking the other way or paid off, you could slip into a stall together. 2 minutes, quick and silent, money exchanged through the gap beneath the door. But the risks were enormous. The police knew exactly what these places were. They sent plainclothes officers to pose as clients, to wait for you to make an offer or a gesture explicit enough to justify arrest. Entrapment was standard practice. There are court records, dozens of them, of young men arrested in public lavatories for soliciting for an immoral purpose or gross indecency. The officer would testify that the defendant made an indecent suggestion. The defendant would claim entrapment. The magistrate would almost always side with the officer. You learned to spot the police, usually. They tried to dress like gentlemen, but their boots were too practical, their posture too rigid. They did not quite know the codes, the subtle signals. A real client would never stare too openly, would never speak too loudly, would never ask outright. The police often did. If something felt wrong, you walked away. Better to lose a potential customer than to lose your freedom. The penalties were harsh, very harsh. Before 1885, sodomy, defined as anal penetration, was still technically a capital crime, though by the Victorian era, it usually resulted in life imprisonment rather than hanging. The last executions for sodomy in England happened in the 1830s, but in 1885, the Criminal Law Amendment Act added a new clause, Section 11, which criminalised any act of gross indecency between men. This was deliberately vague. It covered everything: touching, kissing, mutual masturbation, oral sex, anything at all. The penalty was up to 2 years of hard labour. This is the law that would later destroy Oscar Wilde, but it destroyed hundreds of working-class rent boys first. You lived under constant threat. Every client could be a police officer. Every transaction could end in arrest. And if you were arrested, there was no sympathetic jury waiting. You were a sodomite, a Mary Ann, a creature of vice. The newspapers would print your name and address. Your landlady would evict you. Your family, if you still had one, would disown you. And you would spend 2 years breaking rocks in prison, where the other inmates might beat you just for being queer. So you were careful. Very careful. You developed instincts. You learned the rhythms of police patrols. You knew which beat cops could be bribed and which ones were zealots. You worked with other rent boys, informally, sharing information. Avoid Leicester Square tonight, there is a sweep. The tall officer near the Haymarket, he arrested Tommy last week. Survival depended on community, even a fragile, invisible one. Let us talk about the clients themselves, because they were not a monolith. They came from every class, every background, every corner of Victorian society. What united them was desire they could not express anywhere else and the money to pay for discretion. Some were married men, respectable husbands and fathers. They would leave their homes in the suburbs, tell their wives they had business in the city or a club meeting, and instead they would find you. They were often the most paranoid clients, the ones who insisted on total silence, who would not give their real names, who paid extra for you to leave first, so no one would see you together. They wanted sex quickly and efficiently, and then they wanted to forget it happened. You were a transaction, a relief, a shameful necessity. Some were young gentlemen, university men, officers. These were the ones who still had some romance about it, who sometimes wanted more than just sex. They might buy you dinner first, at a chop house, where no one knew them. They might ask your name, and actually remember it. A few even convinced themselves they were in love with you, which was dangerous in a different way. Romantic clients got possessive. They wrote letters you had to burn. They showed up at inconvenient times. They wanted exclusivity, which you could not afford to give. Some were older men, wealthy men, titled men. These were the best clients financially, and often the worst in every other way. They had done this for decades. They knew exactly what they wanted and how much they would pay. Some kept long-term arrangements with 1 or 2 young men, setting them up in private lodgings, essentially keeping them. This was safer than street work, but came with its own cage. You were dependent on his continued interest. If he tired of you or found someone younger, you were back on the street with nothing. And some were clergymen. Yes, clergymen. The number of Victorian vicars and curates arrested for indecency with young men is genuinely staggering. There are court records of respectable Church of England priests caught in public lavatories, in parks, in railway stations. The very men who preached hellfire for sodomy on Sunday were the ones paying you on Tuesday. The hypocrisy was so thick you could choke on it, but it also made a certain sense. Where else could a closeted Victorian clergyman express his desires? He could not marry a man. He could not court a man. He could only pay for one, in secret, and then spend the rest of his week drowning in guilt and prayer. You tried not to judge. Judging did not pay rent. Every client was a contradiction. They wanted you desperately and hated themselves for it. They paid you and despised you. They needed you invisible and available at the same time. You were their secret, their shame, their relief. And you were always, always disposable. The actual sex was rarely enjoyable for you. Let us be honest about that. This was not romance. This was not mutual pleasure. This was work, often unpleasant work. You did what they paid for, in whatever location you could manage, and you tried to finish as quickly as possible. Sometimes it was in an alley, pressed against a brick wall that scraped your face. Sometimes in a rented room above a pub, where the landlord knew exactly what was happening and charged double. Sometimes in the client's own home, if he was wealthy and reckless enough, though that was rare and dangerous. You learned to disconnect, to let your mind drift. You thought about what you would buy with the money. A hot meal, a new shirt, coal for your fire. You counted the cracks in the ceiling. You waited for it to be over. Some clients were rough, some were gentle. Most were somewhere in between, fumbling and hurried and desperate. A few hurt you on purpose. Those you tried to avoid the second time, but money was money, and sometimes you could not afford to be selective. Afterward, there was always a moment of danger. The client had finished, you had been paid, but now he had to look at you, this young man who just witnessed his greatest shame, and decide what to do. Most simply left, walking quickly in the opposite direction. Some became angry, as if you had seduced them, rather than the reverse. They might shove you, call you names, threaten to report you to the police, which was darkly funny, considering they had just committed the same crime. You learned to leave first when possible, to take the money and disappear before the guilt turned to rage. And then you went and found the next one. Because one client was never enough. Rent was not the only expense. You needed food, clothing, candles, soap, the occasional bribe to a police officer or a landlady. You needed a buffer for the slow nights, the rainy weeks when clients stayed home, the times you got sick and could not work. So you worked the arcade again. You worked the conveniences. You walked Piccadilly and the Haymarket and the Strand, looking for the next man who would glance back. Some nights you made good money. 10 shillings. £1 if you were extraordinarily lucky. Some nights you made nothing and went home cold and hungry and wondering if this was sustainable, if you would still be doing this at 30, at 40, if you would survive that long. The average life expectancy for a male prostitute in Victorian London was not something anyone kept statistics on, but it was not good. Disease, violence, prison, suicide. These were the usual endpoints. Very few rent boys grew old. Let us talk about the others, the community you were part of, whether you wanted to be or not. Because you were not alone. There were hundreds of young men doing exactly what you did, scattered across London, working the same streets, competing for the same clients, facing the same dangers. You were not friends, exactly. This was not a job that encouraged trust, but you recognized each other. You shared information. You developed a rough code. There were the regulars, the boys you saw night after night. Tommy worked the Burlington Arcade and had been doing this since he was 14. He was 20 now, aging out, and he knew it. Clients wanted younger. He was trying to save enough to leave London, maybe get work on a ship, though he never quite managed to save anything. There was Jack, who was built like a boxer and specialized in clients who wanted rough trade, working-class masculinity, someone who looked like he might hurt them. Jack made good money but drank most of it. There was Freddie, who everyone called Frilly Freddie, because he wore rouge and painted his lips and walked with an exaggerated sway. Freddie worked a different market, clients who wanted obvious femininity, who called him she and pretended he was a woman in the dark. Freddie did not mind. Freddie leaned into it. Freddie had perfected the art of survival through performance. And there was Charlie, who was 16 and new and had no idea what he was doing. You saw Charlie lingering near the Opera Arcade one night, obviously trying to work but signalling all wrong, too obvious, too desperate. You pulled him aside and told him the basics, how to spot police, how to negotiate, where not to go. Charlie looked at you like you had just saved his life, which maybe you had. A week later you heard Charlie had been arrested anyway. The police got him in a public toilet. 2 years hard labour. He was 17 by the time he went to trial. You tried not to think about Charlie. The thing was, you were all replaceable. For every boy arrested, Another arrived from the countryside, desperate and hungry and willing to do anything to survive in the city. The supply never ran out. Victorian London was full of young men with no prospects, no family, no options. The workhouse was worse than prostitution. Starvation was worse. At least this way you had some control, some agency, some ability to eat. The older rent boys, the ones who had survived into their 30s, were cautionary tales. There was Albert, who worked the cheaper districts now, down by the docks where sailors paid less but asked fewer questions. Albert had a scar across his face from a client who cut him 7 years ago. He walked with a limp from a beating he took from police in '79. He looked 50, but was probably 35. He drank gin for breakfast and died in a workhouse infirmary in 1887, alone, from pneumonia that started as a cough he could not afford to treat. You saw your future in men like Albert and told yourself you would be different. You would save money. You would get out. You would find legitimate work, maybe as a clerk or a shop assistant, somewhere respectable. But legitimate work required references, respectability, a clean record. You had none of those things. And the longer you did this work, the harder it became to imagine doing anything else. You learned to live at night. You learned to read men in seconds. You learned to tolerate things you never thought you could tolerate. These were not skills that translated to normal employment. So you kept working, night after night. Let us talk about the actual process of a transaction, step by step, because the mechanics matter. You have caught a man's eye in the arcade. He is well-dressed, 40-something, wedding ring catching the gaslight. He has slowed his walking pace. You have slowed yours. Now you are walking parallel, a few feet apart, not looking at each other directly, but aware of every movement the other makes. You exit the arcade onto the street. He follows, 20 paces behind. You turn down a side street, narrower, darker. He is still following. This is the moment of commitment. If he were going to lose his nerve, he would do it now. But he does not. He closes the distance slightly. You stop, pretend to examine something in a shop window. He stops beside you. Evening, you say quietly, voice neutral, not too eager. Good evening, he replies. His voice is tight, nervous. Looking for company? Direct. No point dancing around it now. He hesitates, glances around. The street is empty except for a lamplighter working his way down the opposite side. Perhaps. What are you offering? You have learned to be explicit. Misunderstandings lead to problems. Whatever you like, sir. Hand, mouth, the whole business if you prefer. Depends on what you are willing to pay. His face flushes even in the dim light. How much? 5 shillings for the full service, 3 for anything else. This is higher than average. You are testing him. Rich men sometimes pay asking price just to avoid the embarrassment of negotiating. Poor men, or men who do this regularly, will counter-offer. That is rather a lot. Quality costs, sir. I am clean, I am discreet, and I know what I am doing. But if it is too much, no hard feelings. You start to turn away. The oldest trick. Make them think they might lose you. Wait. He reaches for his pocket. 5 shillings. But it must be quick and private. I know a place. Follow me, but not too close. You lead him 3 streets over into a maze of alleys behind a coaching inn. There is a recessed doorway here, an old storage entrance that is never used after dark. It is filthy. It smells of horse piss and rot, but it is private enough. You have used it a dozen times. Here? He sounds appalled. Unless you have a room nearby, sir. You know he does not. Men with rooms do not pick up rent boys in arcades. He looks around, disgusted and aroused in equal measure. I suppose it will have to do. Payment first if you do not mind. He hands over 5 shillings. You count it quickly, pocket it. Now, the actual work begins. He wants full penetration. Most nervous clients do, as if anything less is not worth the risk they are taking. You turn around, brace yourself against the wall. You have a small tin of lard in your pocket for this purpose. You prepare yourself quickly, efficiently, trying not to think about the cold or the smell or the fact that this stranger is about to be inside you. It hurts. It almost always hurts. Not as much as it did the first dozen times, back when you were new and did not know to prepare properly, when you bled and limped for days afterward. But it still hurts. You have learned to breathe through it, to relax muscles that want to clench, to make small encouraging noises that convince the client he is doing well, so he will finish faster. He finishes in under 3 minutes, probably a personal record for him. He pulls away immediately, fumbling with his trousers, breathing hard. You straighten your own clothing, wipe yourself with a rag you keep for this purpose. There is an awkward moment where you are both standing in a filthy alley, the transaction complete, the illusion shattered. You will not speak of this, he says, and it is trying to be a command, but comes out as a plea. Never do, sir. Discretion guaranteed. He walks away quickly, heading back toward the lights and respectability. You wait a full minute before leaving the alley, taking a different route. Never follow a client. Never give any appearance of connection. 5 shillings earned. Maybe 15 minutes of total interaction. You head to a pub, a rough place in Soho, where the barman does not ask questions, and the meat pies are cheap and hot. You buy one for 3p, eat it standing at the bar, wash it down with a pint of bitter. The warmth of the food helps. So does the beer. You are trying not to think about what just happened, how you will do it again in an hour, how this is your life now. A man at the end of the bar is watching you, not a client, another rent boy. He comes over. You recognize him vaguely, seen him working the Haymarket. Good night, he asks. Could be worse. Heard there is a sweep planned for the weekend. Police are trying to clear out the Piccadilly trade before some royal visits. Appreciated. Information like this is currency. You will return the favour someday. He nods and moves off. You finish your beer and head back out. The night is young. You need at least 2 more clients to feel secure about your week. Winter was the hardest season for obvious reasons. The cold made street work nearly unbearable. You could not loiter in arcades for hours without looking suspicious when you were shivering and stamping your feet. Clients were less willing to conduct business in alleyways when frost turned your breath to visible clouds. The public conveniences were freezing, and the attendants were less likely to be bribed when they themselves were miserable. Some rent boys tried to move indoors during winter, finding work in the few establishments that catered to male clients. These were not brothels exactly. They were usually pubs or hotels or lodging houses with proprietors who looked the other way, who rented rooms by the hour, who allowed certain transactions on their premises for a percentage of the fee. A place in Cleveland Street was famous for this, run by a man named Charles Hammond, who employed teenage telegraph boys as prostitutes and catered to an upper-class clientele. The Cleveland Street scandal would blow up in 1889, destroy several aristocratic reputations, and nearly implicate members of the royal family. But in 1885, it is still operating quietly. You tried working there once. Hammond wanted you to live on premises, to be available whenever a client requested you, to split your earnings 60-40 in his favour. In exchange, you would have a bed, regular meals, protection from police. Some boys took the deal, you did not. It felt too much like ownership. At least on the streets you controlled your own time, chose your own clients, kept all your money. The loss of freedom was not worth the security. So you endured the winter on the streets, wearing every layer you owned, developing a cough that would not quit, trying to work through chilblains and exhaustion. The clients who ventured out in winter were often the most desperate, the most dangerous, or the most depraved. Normal men with normal desires could wait for spring. The ones who braved the December cold wanted things they could not wait for. Some wanted violent sex. Some wanted boys who looked even younger than you. Some wanted things you would not do at any price. And you learned to walk away even when you were hungry. You also learned which public buildings stayed warm after dark. The larger railway stations, Paddington and Charing Cross, had waiting rooms with coal fires. You could sit there for hours pretending to wait for a train, warming yourself, maybe dozing on a bench if the attendant was lenient. The better hotels had lobbies that were semi-public. If you dressed well enough, you could sit in a corner with a newspaper and no one bothered you for an hour or two. The churches were always unlocked, theoretically. Some rent boys slept in church pews on the coldest nights. The clergy usually turned a blind eye. Christian charity extended even to sodomites when hypothermia was the alternative. But you were always gone before morning services. You had some pride left, or at least some sense of irony about seeking shelter in a building dedicated to a god that supposedly condemned you to hell. There was a particular cruelty to Victorian Christianity's treatment of men like you. The same Bible that commanded love and charity and caring for the least among us was weaponized to justify your criminalization, your imprisonment, your exclusion from every form of social support. If you were starving, the charitable societies would not help you because your poverty was a moral failing. If you were sick, the hospitals might refuse treatment if they suspected how you earned your living. If you were arrested, the prison chaplain would tell you that your suffering was deserved, that you were being punished by God for your perversion. And yet the clients, many of them, considered themselves good Christians. They attended church on Sunday, took communion, sang hymns, supported missionary work in Africa, and then on Monday, they paid you for sex in a public toilet. The cognitive dissonance was astonishing. But you suppose humans have always been excellent at holding contradictory beliefs when it suits them. Let us talk about disease, because that was the other constant threat beyond police and violence. Sexually transmitted infections were rampant in Victorian London, and medical treatment was rudimentary at best. Gonorrhea, syphilis, chancroid. These moved through the population like wildfire, transmitted between prostitutes and clients and wives, in an endless cycle that Victorian medicine barely understood and could not cure. As a male prostitute, you were at enormous risk. Condoms existed, made from sheep intestine or rubber, but they were expensive, unreliable, and most clients refused to use them. The sensation was supposedly diminished, and besides, many clients convinced themselves that you were somehow cleaner than a female prostitute, that sex between men carried less disease risk. This was spectacularly wrong, but it was a comforting lie. You checked yourself obsessively. Any discharge, any sore, any rash, and you knew you were in trouble. Gonorrhea was the most common, called the clap on the streets. It caused burning urination, discharge, and if left untreated, could lead to chronic pain, infertility, and systemic infection. Treatment involved irrigation of the urethra with various solutions, potassium permanganate, silver nitrate, that were nearly as painful as the disease. You had it twice. Both times you treated yourself with remedies purchased from a dubious chemist in Whitechapel, spent 2 weeks in agony, and eventually recovered. Syphilis was the terror, the slow killer. It started as a sore, often missed or ignored, then a rash. Then it seemed to disappear, hiding in your body for years before emerging as tertiary syphilis that destroyed your brain, your heart, your spine. You watched a rent boy named Eddie die of it in St. Bartholomew's Hospital in 1884. He was 28, but looked ancient, covered in gummers, grotesque lesions, unable to walk, his mind gone. He screamed about demons. He died raving. The nurses would not touch him without gloves. The mercury treatments for syphilis were almost as bad as the disease. Mercury pills, mercury ointments, mercury vapor baths. The idea being that you would salivate the infection out of your body. What actually happened was mercury poisoning, which caused your teeth to fall out, your gums to rot, tremors, kidney failure. The phrase, "a night with Venus, a lifetime with Mercury," was common. You knew boys who chose the disease over the treatment. And there were other infections, less famous but equally miserable. Pubic lice, which you picked up from filthy clients or filthy bedding and treated with kerosene that burned your skin. Scabies, tiny mites that burrowed and itched until you clawed yourself bloody. Bacterial infections from cuts and tears that became abscesses. anal fissures that made every bowel movement agony, hemorrhoids from repeated trauma. The work destroyed your body slowly, piece by piece. You could not see a regular doctor. Not honestly. If you told a Victorian physician how you earned your living, he might refuse treatment. He might report you to police. He might give you a lecture about sin and morality while you bled. So you lied. You said you were a shop assistant, a clerk, anything respectable. And you hoped the doctor did not ask too many questions about the nature of your symptoms. There were a few doctors who treated prostitutes, male and female, without judgment. They worked in the slums, in charitable dispensaries, seeing patients who paid in pennies or not at all. They had seen everything. They asked no questions. You found one eventually, an older man with rooms near 7 Dials who treated you for gonorrhea and asked only whether you were using any protection. When you said clients refused, he sighed and gave you a tin of zinc ointment. Apply this after each encounter. It may help. Somewhat. It did not help much. But the fact that he tried, that he treated you like a human being rather than a moral failure, meant everything. There were moments of something almost like tenderness, though they were rare and complicated. A client in the winter of 1886, a man named Mr. Worth, probably not his real name, who saw you 3 times over the course of a month. He was different from the start. He wanted to talk. He bought you dinner at a chop house in Bloomsbury, told you about his life in the most carefully vague terms. He was a barrister. He was married. He had 3 children. He had known he desired men since he was at university, but had done the expected thing, married well, built a career. I feel half alive, he told you over mutton and potatoes, as if I am performing a role every moment of every day. You did not know what to say to that. Your role was to listen and agree and make him feel understood. But part of you did understand. You were performing too, performing masculinity that was acceptable, performing desire you did not feel, performing a version of yourself that could survive in a world that wanted you erased. Mr. Worth paid you 10 shillings each time, which was generous. He wanted full sex but also kissing, holding, the simulation of intimacy. He called you by your name instead of boy or nothing at all. Afterward, he would lie beside you in the rented room and talk about his disappointments, his regrets, his loneliness. You wanted to feel sorry for him. Rich, respected, married with children, and still miserable because he could not be who he was. But your sympathy was limited. He had choices you did not have. He could have decided not to marry, could have lived alone, could have resisted the social pressure. Instead, he chose the lie, and now he wanted you to absolve him of it, to make him feel like a victim rather than a coward. The 4th time he came looking for you, you were not in your usual spot. He never found you again. You assume he found another boy to listen to his sad stories, but there were also clients who showed you casual cruelty so sharp it took your breath away. A man who paid you 3 shillings for oral sex finished, and then spat on you, called you a filthy degenerate, told you that you were going to hell. All this from a man who had just had his cock in your mouth. You stood there with his spit on your face and his money in your hand and wondered how someone could contain that much self-hatred. A client who hired you, took you to a rented room, and then could not perform. He blamed you, said you were not attractive enough, not young enough, not skilled enough. He demanded his money back. When you refused, you had already spent time with him, missed other clients. He punched you in the stomach hard enough to drop you, took his money from your pocket while you wheezed on the floor, left. A client who wanted to hurt you, who paid extra for the privilege, who used you with such violence that you bled and limped for a week. You told yourself you would never see him again. But when he appeared 3 months later offering double the previous rate, you needed the money. So you went, and he hurt you again. And you took it because survival demanded it. These were the transactions that made you feel less than human. That made you understand, viscerally, that you were a commodity, a body for rent, A convenience. Disposable. You tried once to have something real. There was a boy named William who sold flowers in Covent Garden during the day and did what you did at night. You kept running into each other, competing for the same clients, working the same arcades. Eventually you started talking, sharing information, then sharing a drink, then sharing more. William was 19, from Essex originally, with dark curly hair and a gap between his front teeth that made his smile crooked and charming. He made you laugh, which was rare. He understood the life because he lived it. You did not have to explain, or perform, or pretend. You could be tired and scared and angry, and he would simply nod. You started spending nights together when neither of you had work. Not for sex, you had both had enough of sex, but for warmth, for company, for the simple comfort of sleeping beside another human being who knew your real name. You thought maybe this could be something, a partnership, a future. William was arrested in April, soliciting in a public convenience, an undercover officer. You went to the trial, watched from the public gallery. The officer testified that William had made an explicit proposal, had touched him inappropriately. William's defense was hopeless. His lawyer argued entrapment, but the magistrate was not interested. 2 years hard labor. William looked up at the gallery as they took him away, found your face in the crowd. He did not look scared. He looked resigned. Like he had always known this was how it would end. You never saw him again. You heard later that he died in prison, 8 months into his sentence. Pneumonia, officially. But prison pneumonia was often code for beaten to death, or worked to death, or gave up and stopped eating. After William, you stopped trying to have anything real. It was easier that way, safer. You could not grieve someone you had never let yourself care about. Let us talk about the clients who were not clients, the men who sought out rent boys for other reasons. The blackmailers were a constant danger. A man would approach you, go through the motions of negotiation, maybe even go through with the transaction. Then, days or weeks later, he would find you again. This time, his demeanor would be different. Cold, threatening. He would tell you that he knew your name, knew where you lived, had witnesses or evidence of what you had done together. Unless you paid him, regularly, indefinitely, he would go to the police. This was called the badger game, and it was devastatingly effective. Most rent boys could not go to the police themselves. You had committed a crime. Your blackmailer was also a criminal, technically, but he could frame the story as victim and extortionist rather than two participants in illegal sex. And many blackmailers had connections with corrupt police officers who would support their version of events for a cut of the profits. You paid blackmailers when you had to, which meant working extra nights to cover their demands on top of your actual expenses. There was a particularly vicious blackmailer who worked the West End in the mid-1880s, a man called Burton, who had refined the practice to an art form.
Burton would pose as a client, complete the transaction, and then produce a small notebook where he had recorded your physical description, the date, the location, and graphic details of what had occurred. He claimed to have connections with a vice squad officer. Whether this was true or not, the threat was enough. Burton extracted money from at least a dozen rent boys that you knew of. Weekly payments, usually a shilling or two, which does not sound like much until you realize that was sometimes half your earnings. You paid him for 3 months in 1886 until he simply disappeared. You heard later that he had been murdered, beaten to death in an alley near Limehouse, and while you had no proof, you suspected it was one of the boys he had been extorting. No one was arrested. No one mourned him. There were also the reformers, middle-class do-gooders who descended into the slums to save prostitutes. They usually focused on women, offering rescue homes and laundries and relentless moralizing, but occasionally they targeted young men too. They would approach you on the street, these earnest ladies and gentlemen from the Church of England Temperance Society, or the Society for the Suppression of Vice, and offer you a path to redemption. "Young man, you do not have to live this way," they would say. as if you had chosen this life from a menu of equally appealing options. We can help you find honest work. The honest work they offered was brutal, low-paid labor that would leave you starving. Factory work at 8 shillings a week. Agricultural labor in the countryside, which meant leaving London entirely. Positions as servants, which required references you did not have. They meant well, probably, but their help was useless. And underlying all their charity was the assumption that you were a victim, that you had been corrupted or seduced, that you needed to be rescued from yourself. They could not conceive that some men simply desired other men, that this was not a disease or a moral failing, but simply how some people were made. The entire framework of Victorian reform assumed that homosexuality was a temporary affliction that could be cured through prayer, hard work, and separation from bad influences. You listened politely to their speeches, took their pamphlets, and went right back to work. You needed to eat more than you needed salvation. There were hierarchies within the world of male prostitution, subtle gradations of status and specialization. At the top were the kept boys, young men who had secured long-term arrangements with wealthy patrons. They lived in private lodgings, paid for by their benefactors, received allowances, dressed well, and were expected to be available exclusively to one man. This was the closest thing to security the trade offered. Some kept boys managed to save money, learn skills, and eventually transition to legitimate life. Others became so dependent on their patron that when the arrangement ended, and it always ended, they had nothing. Then there were the theatre boys, young men who worked in music halls and theatres as performers, stagehands or dressers, and supplemented their income through prostitution. The theatre world was more tolerant of sexual diversity than most of Victorian society. Everyone knew that certain chorus boys were available for private engagements. Some theatre managers actively procured young men for wealthy patrons who attended performances. It was an open secret. Below that were the street workers like you, independent operators who took their chances nightly. And at the bottom were the dockside workers, the boys who serviced sailors and labourers in the East End for pennies, who worked in conditions of absolute squalor, who usually did not survive long. Disease, violence, and alcoholism killed them young. They were the invisible casualties of Victorian poverty, the ones no reformer ever reached, the ones whose deaths went unrecorded. You were acutely aware of how easily you could slip down this hierarchy. A few bad months, an arrest that did not quite stick, but ruined your reputation, an injury that made you less desirable, and you could find yourself working the docks, desperate and dying. There was also specialization by type, by the particular fantasy a boy could fulfill. Some boys cultivated extreme femininity, like Frilly Freddy. They wore cosmetics, feminine clothing when they could get away with it, spoke in high voices, and catered to clients who wanted the illusion of heterosexual sex. These boys often faced the worst violence because their clients were the most conflicted, the most ashamed, the most likely to turn rage inward and then outward. Some boys went the opposite direction, emphasizing working-class masculinity. They dressed as laborers, cultivated rough manners, projected toughness. Their clients were usually upper-class men who eroticized the working class, who wanted to be dominated or degraded by someone they considered their social inferior. This was also dangerous work, because these clients sometimes wanted actual violence, wanted to be hit or choked, and if you misjudged how far to go, you could kill someone accidentally. Some boys specialized in extreme youth, pretending to be younger than they were. Clients who wanted this were pedophiles, essentially, though the Victorians did not use that term. They wanted boys who looked 13 or 14, prepubescent if possible. You found these clients particularly revolting, and you were grateful that you had always looked your age or older. But you knew boys who lied about their age, who shaved to look younger, who made good money from men whose desires were even more criminal than the average. And then there were the boys who specialized in pain, in giving or receiving it. Victorian flagellation was a whole subculture, intertwined with prostitution and homosexuality. Men who wanted to be whipped, caned, or otherwise punished. This was tied up in complicated ways with the British public school system, where corporal punishment was routine and often sexualized. Adult men paid to recreate these experiences. There were establishments that catered specifically to this, equipped with whipping posts and canes, and all the paraphernalia of discipline. You tried it once, at the request of a client who offered you a full pound. He wanted to be caned while naked, bent over a chair in a rented room. He provided the cane. He gave you specific instructions about how hard to hit, where to aim. The whole thing was deeply strange. You beat this grown man until his backside was covered in welts and he climaxed from it. You took your pound and never saw him again, but you were haunted by the psychology of it. What had been done to him that this was what aroused him? Let us talk about the legal apparatus in more detail, because understanding the law meant understanding exactly how precarious your existence was. Before 1885, the primary law criminalizing sex between men was the Buggery Act of 1533, which defined sodomy as penetrative anal sex and made it a capital offence. By the Victorian era, this was rarely enforced with execution. The last hangings for sodomy in England were in 1835, but it remained on the books. Conviction meant life imprisonment, or more commonly, 10 to 20 years of penal servitude. The burden of proof was high. Prosecutors had to prove penetration and emission, which was difficult without catching the men in the act. Many arrests for sodomy resulted in lesser convictions or acquittals simply because evidence was insufficient. This created a strange situation where everyone knew what was happening, but the law struggled to address it effectively. This changed in 1885 with the Criminal Law Amendment Act. The act was primarily intended to address child prostitution and raise the age of consent for girls from 13 to 16. But at the last minute, Henry Labouchere, a radical member of Parliament, added an amendment, Section 11, that criminalized gross indecency between men. The language was deliberately vague. It covered any sexual act between men, whether penetrative or not, whether in public or private. The penalty was up to 2 years imprisonment with hard labor. This was the law that transformed male prostitution from a difficult-to-prosecute crime to an easy one. Now police did not need to prove penetration. They only needed evidence of any sexual contact, any indecent behavior. A touch, a kiss, a suggestive comment. Anything could be gross indecency if a magistrate decided it was. The law was also unusual in that it applied equally to both participants. In heterosexual prostitution, the prostitute was criminalized, but the client usually was not. In homosexual encounters under Section 11, both men were equally guilty. This should have meant that respectable clients faced the same risks as rent boys. In practice, it did not work that way. When police arrested a gentleman and a rent boy together, the gentleman had resources. He had a good lawyer. He had character witnesses, vicars, employers, respectable friends who would testify that he was a pillar of the community, that there must be some misunderstanding. He could afford bail. He could sometimes make the problem disappear through connections and bribes. The rent boy had nothing. No lawyer except the court-appointed one who did not care. No character witnesses except other criminals. No bail money. And juries and magistrates were far more willing to believe that a poor young man had seduced or extorted a respectable gentleman than the reverse. So the law, equal on paper, was viciously unequal in practice. You knew of cases where both men were arrested, but only the rent boy was prosecuted. Cases where the gentleman testified against the rent boy in exchange for dropped charges. Cases where the rent boy was given the maximum sentence while the gentleman received a warning. The class bias was absolute. Trials themselves were public spectacles designed to humiliate. The newspapers reported them in salacious detail. Your name, your address, your profession, the exact nature of the charges, all printed for everyone to read. The courtroom was open. Anyone could attend. The prosecutor would read out the most graphic details of your alleged acts, using language designed to shock and disgust. The jury, 12 respectable men, would stare at you with open contempt. If you were convicted, sentencing was immediate. The magistrate would give a speech about moral degradation, about the necessity of protecting society from perverts, about making an example. 2 years hard labour was standard, but it could be less for first offences or more if the magistrate was particularly punitive. Then you were taken directly to prison. Hard labour meant exactly that. Breaking rocks with a hammer in all weather, turning a crank handle thousands of times per day, a pointless task designed only to exhaust you. Picking apart old rope fibre by fibre until your hands bled. Walking the treadmill, a giant wheel you climbed endlessly while it turned beneath you, sometimes for 8 hours a day. The conditions in Victorian prisons were deliberately harsh. Minimal food, usually bread and gruel. No heat in winter. Solitary confinement in tiny cells. Silence rules that prohibited talking to other prisoners. Corporal punishment for any infraction. Men died regularly from disease, exhaustion, or suicide. And if you survived your sentence, you emerged with a criminal record that made legal employment nearly impossible. Most former prisoners returned to exactly what had gotten them arrested in the first place. The system created a cycle: arrest, imprisonment, release, return to prostitution, arrest again. There were occasional moments of resistance, though they were small and largely ineffective. Some rent boys fought back when police tried to arrest them. This usually ended badly. Assaulting an officer added years to your sentence. But sometimes desperation overrode common sense. You saw a boy named Danny punch a plainclothes officer who grabbed him in a public convenience. Danny ran. They caught him 3 streets away and beat him so severely he lost vision in one eye. He got 3 years. Some boys developed elaborate systems of signals to warn each other about police presence. A particular way of standing, a specific phrase, a piece of chalk marking on a wall. These worked until the police figured them out, which they always eventually did. Then you had to develop new signals. There were rare instances of collective action, though calling it organized would be generous. In 1887, a group of rent boys who worked the Haymarket decided to stop paying protection money to a particular corrupt police sergeant who had been extorting them for months. They simply refused collectively. The sergeant arrested 3 of them in retaliation on fabricated charges. But enough boys testified, risking exposure themselves, that the charges did not stick, and the sergeant was quietly reassigned. It was a tiny victory, and it cost the boys involved dearly. But it was something. More commonly, resistance took the form of refusal. Refusing clients who seemed dangerous. Refusing to perform acts you found degrading beyond a certain point. Refusing to inform on other boys when police tried to turn you into an informant. These were small dignities in an undignified profession. Some boys kept diaries or wrote letters, documenting their lives in ways that occasionally survived. These documents are extraordinarily rare because most were destroyed, by the writers themselves, by families who found them after death, by police who seized them as evidence. But a few fragments remain in archives, offering glimpses into the interior lives of Victorian rent boys. One such diary, from a boy identified only as J.S., who worked in London in the 1890s, contains this entry. Earned 4 shillings tonight from a clergyman near St. Paul's. He wept after. They often do. I think they weep for themselves, not for what they have done to me. I am past weeping. Another fragment, a letter never sent, found in the belongings of a rent boy who died in 1886. Mother, if you could see what I have become, you would not claim me as your son. But I am alive, which is more than I can say for the boys who took the righteous path and starved. I do not ask forgiveness because I do not believe I have sinned. God made me this way, and if he condemns me for it, then he is a crueler master than any client I have served. These voices are important. They remind us that rent boys were not just victims or statistics. They were human beings with thoughts, feelings, moral reasoning, and agency, however constrained. Let us talk about the few alternatives available if you wanted to leave the trade. Emigration was one option, theoretically. The British Empire was always looking for young men to populate its colonies. Canada, Australia, New Zealand,
South Africa. Passage could sometimes be obtained cheaply through various emigration schemes. The colonies were advertised as places of new beginnings, where a man's past did not matter and hard work could earn you land and respectability. Some rent boys took this option, saved enough for passage, or worked their passage as ship's crew and disappeared into the colonial frontier. Whether they found the new beginning they hoped for is unknowable, but at least they escaped London, escaped the cycle of arrest and imprisonment that seemed inevitable if you stayed. The military was another option, though increasingly difficult. The Army and Navy had traditionally been fairly tolerant of homosexuality, at least in practice. The official position was condemnation, but in all male environments where men served for years without access to women, certain arrangements were quietly tolerated. However, by the 1880s, the military was tightening its policies. Medical examinations became more rigorous. Background checks were introduced. Courts-martial for sodomy became more common. Still, some boys enlisted. The pay was terrible, the conditions were harsh, and you might be shipped to India or Africa to die of disease or combat. But it was regular employment, regular meals, and escape from prostitution. You knew 2 boys who enlisted. One deserted within 6 months and returned to London. The other died of typhoid in Calcutta. A very few boys managed to transition into legitimate work through connections made as prostitutes. A client might take a genuine interest, might use his influence to secure you a position as a clerk, a shop assistant, a servant. This required the client to care enough to help, which was rare, and to have enough discretion to do so without raising questions about why he was assisting this particular young man. But it happened occasionally. You heard of a boy named Arthur who had been kept by a barrister for 3 years and who, when the arrangement ended, was set up with a small tobacconist's shop and enough capital to run it. Arthur was one of the lucky ones. He disappeared into respectable obscurity. More commonly, boys aged out of prostitution and into desperate poverty. By your late 20s, you were too old for most clients. The trade wanted youth, beauty, novelty. A 30-year-old rent boy was an object of pity or contempt. Some managed to find work as servants or labourers, jobs where their past might not be questioned too closely. Others drifted into workhouses, those grim institutions where the destitute went to perform hard labour in exchange for minimal food and shelter. The workhouse was the nightmare that haunted every rent boy. It was admission of complete failure, of having outlived your usefulness, of having no family or friends or resources left. Workhouses were designed to be deterrents. Conditions were kept deliberately worse than the worst poverty outside, so that only the truly desperate would enter. Once inside, you were separated by gender, stripped, disinfected, dressed in uniform, and set to work at tedious tasks. You lost all autonomy, all privacy, all dignity. Some boys chose suicide over the workhouse. Drowning in the Thames was common, cheap, relatively quick, and your body would probably never be identified. Hanging was another option, though you needed privacy for it. Poison was expensive and unreliable. There are no statistics on suicide rates among male prostitutes in Victorian London, but anecdotal evidence suggests it was high. There were occasional public scandals that lifted the veil on the world of male prostitution, usually to the horror of respectable society. The Dublin Castle scandal of 1884 involved allegations that important government officials in Dublin had been involved with male prostitutes. The investigation was quickly suppressed, but rumours persisted. The Cleveland Street scandal of 1889 was much bigger and harder to suppress. It started with a theft investigation. A boy named Charles Swinskow was caught stealing from the Central Telegraph Office where he worked. Under questioning, he admitted he had money from prostitution. He had been working at a male brothel at 19 Cleveland Street, procured by a man named Charles Hammond. The police investigation widened. More boys were questioned. More clients were identified. The client list was explosive. It included Lord Arthur Somerset, an aristocrat and equerry to the Prince of Wales. It possibly included Prince Albert Victor, the Queen's grandson, though this was never proven. The scandal threatened to reach the highest levels of British society. The response was a masterclass in class-based justice. The working-class boys involved were arrested and prosecuted. Charles Hammond, the brothel keeper, fled to France and was never extradited. Lord Arthur Somerset also fled to France, assisted by government officials who warned him before a warrant was issued. He lived in comfortable exile for the rest of his life and was never punished. The newspaper coverage was sensational, but also revealed the double standards at play. The boys were described as corrupt, depraved, criminal. The aristocratic clients were described as victims, led astray, more to be pitied than condemned. The Times wrote that Lord Somerset had been betrayed by his social inferiors, as if the teenage telegraph boys had seduced him rather than been paid by him. For rent boys working in London, the Cleveland Street scandal had mixed effects. Temporarily, police pressure increased. There were more raids, more arrests, more surveillance. But the scandal also exposed the hypocrisy of the system, showed that wealthy and powerful men were buying the same services as everyone else, and created a certain cynicism about the moral righteousness of Victorian sexual norms. You were not directly affected, you did not work at Cleveland Street, did not know any of the boys involved, but you watched the scandal unfold with grim fascination. It confirmed what you already knew. The law existed to punish the poor and protect the rich. Sex between men was only a crime when both participants were expendable. Let us talk about the geography of London in more detail, the specific locations where prostitution flourished. The West End was the premium territory, Piccadilly, Leicester Square, the Haymarket, the Strand. These were well-lit, well-trafficked areas where wealthy men went for entertainment. The theatres, the restaurants, the hotels, the clubs, all created foot traffic and opportunities. The arcades provided shelter. The public conveniences were numerous and relatively clean. You worked the West End when you could. Competition was fierce. On a good night there might be 20 boys working Piccadilly Circus alone, but the clients paid better. 5 shillings was reasonable. 10 was possible. You once earned £1 from a foreign gentleman, probably a tourist, who did not know the going rates and was too embarrassed to negotiate. Soho was different territory, grittier and more dangerous. The streets were narrower, darker, more labyrinthine. The police presence was lighter, which was good and bad. Good because you were less likely to be arrested. Bad because you were less protected if a client turned violent. Soho attracted a different sort of client. Younger men, working-class men, sailors on leave, men who wanted quick, cheap transactions. You worked Soho when you were desperate or when the West End was too hot with police activity. The rates were lower, 2 or 3 shillings usually, but work was more available. Soho also had more informal establishments where transactions could happen. Certain pubs with back rooms, lodging houses that rented by the hour, even private homes where landlords looked the other way. The parks were seasonal work, best in summer. Hyde Park, Green Park, St. James's Park. After dark, these became cruising grounds. Men walked the paths, sat on benches, disappeared into the bushes. It was less explicitly commercial than the arcades. Some men were looking for free encounters, not prostitution. But money still changed hands, and rent boys worked the parks alongside amateurs. The risk in parks was weather and visibility. You needed darkness for cover, but too much darkness made it hard for clients to find you. Rain made everything miserable, and police patrols were unpredictable. You could be arrested simply for loitering in a park after dark, even without evidence of any sexual activity. The docks in the East End were desperate territory, and you avoided them. Wapping, Shadwell, Limehouse. These were where the poorest prostitutes worked, servicing sailors and labourers for pennies. The conditions were squalid, the violence was constant, and disease was rampant. Boys who worked the docks usually had no other options. They were too old, too damaged, too addicted to alcohol or opium to work anywhere else. You went to the docks only once, when you were nearly broke and could not find work anywhere else.
You stood on a street corner near the Prospect of Whitby pub and waited. The client who picked you up was a Danish sailor, drunk, who paid you $1 for sex in an alley so filthy you could not see the ground. You left as soon as it was over and swore never to return. That was your future if you did not stay vigilant. The docks, the final degradation before death. Certain railway stations also became known cruising spots: Charing Cross, Paddington, Victoria. These were liminal spaces where people came and went, where loitering was normal, where a certain amount of anonymity was possible. The public conveniences at major stations were particularly active. You worked Charing Cross sometimes, late at night when trains were arriving from the suburbs, and men who had missed the last train home needed somewhere to wait. Some of them wanted company while they waited. The Turkish baths were another world entirely, expensive establishments that catered to a specific clientele. These were not the public baths where working-class Londoners went to wash. These were luxurious spaces: the Hammam in Jermyn Street, the Imperial on Russell Square, with marble floors, steam rooms, massage tables, and private cubicles. Membership was expensive. The clientele was exclusively upper class, and everyone knew what went on in the private rooms after the attendants left for the night. You were taken to the hammam once by a client who paid for your entry as his guest. The opulence was startling. Mosaic tiles, Turkish carpets, brass fixtures, attendants in pristine white uniforms. Men reclined on couches in towels, reading newspapers, drinking tea, as if this were the most natural thing in the world. Some were genuinely there for therapeutic bathing, others were hunting. The actual sex happened in the private cubicles, small rooms with beds where men supposedly rested after bathing. Your client led you to one, locked the door, and conducted business with a casualness that suggested he did this regularly. Afterward, he offered you a cigar and made small talk as if you were social equals, which you absolutely were not. You left through a side entrance feeling like you had glimpsed a secret society, a whole parallel world where wealthy homosexual men could congregate in relative safety. Access to these spaces was impossible without a sponsor. You could not simply walk into the hammam and loiter. You needed to be brought in by a member. This meant that the Turkish baths operated as a kind of closed loop. Wealthy men meeting other wealthy men, occasionally bringing in a hired boy for variety, but generally keeping the trade within their own class. You preferred the streets. At least there you knew the rules. Let us talk about the language, the coded communication that allowed gay men to find each other in a hostile society. Victorian homosexuals developed an entire secret vocabulary, what scholars would later call polari, though it was not formalized or universal. Different words and phrases had specific meanings within the subculture that were opaque to outsiders. A Mary-Ann, or just Mary, was a homosexual man, especially an effeminate one, or a prostitute. The origin of the term is unclear, but it was widely used by the 1870s. Trade meant both heterosexual men willing to have sex with men for money, and the act of prostitution itself. Rough trade was dangerous clients, usually working-class men, who might turn violent. Camp was behavior or speech that was exaggeratedly effeminate or theatrical. To camp it up was to perform flamboyant femininity. This was both a survival strategy and a form of resistance. By exaggerating the stereotype, you could sometimes diffuse threats with humor or signal to other gay men that you were one of them. Certain questions had coded meanings. Are you musical? Was code for, are you gay? The response, yes, very musical, or I am in the choir, confirmed it. This allowed men to identify each other in public without risking exposure if they had misread the situation. If the other person did not understand the code, they would simply answer the question literally, and you could move on. Eye contact had its own language. A direct gaze held slightly too long. A glance downward, and then back up, looking at someone, looking away when they noticed, then looking back to see if they were still looking. This was cruising. the art of nonverbal communication that allowed men to signal interest without words. Physical positioning mattered too. Standing at a urinal but not actually urinating. Lingering near certain statues or monuments that had become known meeting spots. Walking the same stretch of pavement repeatedly. These behaviors were obvious to those who knew what to look for, and mostly invisible to those who did not. Clothing carried signals as well. A red necktie was rumored to indicate homosexuality, though this was never universal or reliable. Very tight trousers, particular styles of coat, a flower in the buttonhole, especially a green carnation after Oscar Wilde made it famous. But these signals were dangerous because they were becoming known to police and moralists, which meant they could attract exactly the wrong kind of attention. Touch was the most direct signal. A hand lingering on a shoulder, fingers brushing against fingers while passing something, sitting closer than necessary on a bench. These micro-touches conveyed interest and tested response. If the other person pulled away, you had your answer. If they leaned in, you proceeded. The entire system was subtle, deniable, and fragile. It had to be. One wrong signal to the wrong person could mean arrest, blackmail, or violence. You learn to read people with extraordinary precision. Body language, tone of voice, context, intuition, all factored into split-second decisions about whether someone was safe to approach. Let us talk about the role of alcohol in the trade, because it was absolutely central. You drank to manage the work, not to excess usually, because you needed to stay alert enough to avoid police and dangerous clients, but enough to numb yourself, to make the physical and emotional violations slightly more bearable. A pint before work gave you courage. A pint after helped you forget. Pubs were also where business happened. Certain establishments in Soho and the East End were known to tolerate or encourage homosexual prostitution. The landlords knew what was going on and took a percentage, either through overpriced drinks or direct payments. You could sit in these pubs nursing a beer and wait for clients to approach you. The Crown and Cushion in Soho was one such place. The White Swan near Charing Cross was another. These pubs had backrooms where transactions could be finalised, where money changed hands, where you could negotiate terms without being overheard. The landlords employed barmen who knew to look the other way, who would warn you if police were asking questions. But alcohol was also destroying men all around you. Rent boys who drank too much, too often, trying to obliterate the reality of their lives. You watched boys spiral, from controlled drinking to dependency, to complete dysfunction. A boy named Peter started out having a few drinks to steady his nerves, and within a year was drinking from the moment he woke up. He could not work anymore because he was too drunk to negotiate, too drunk to perform, too drunk to avoid arrest. He died of liver failure at 24. Gin was the particular poison of the poor. Cheap, strong, available everywhere. Mother's ruin, they called it, though it ruined plenty of men too. A penny bought you enough gin to forget your troubles for an hour. Sixpence bought you oblivion. The gin palaces that lined the major streets were designed to entice. Bright lights, gilt mirrors, polished bars, making the poison look glamorous. You tried to stay away from gin. You had seen what it did. But there were nights when beer was not enough, when the accumulated weight of everything you had done and everything that had been done to you pressed down so heavily that you needed something stronger. On those nights, you bought gin and drank it fast and hated yourself both for needing it and for being weak enough to give in. Opium was less common but present, especially in the East End. The opium dens in Limehouse catered mostly to Chinese sailors and dock workers, but some rent boys used it. Opium offered a different escape. Not the aggressive numbness of alcohol, but a dreamy floating detachment. You tried it once with another rent boy who wanted company. The experience was pleasant in the moment, but left you sick and slow for 2 days afterward. You could not afford to lose 2 days of work, so you never went back. Some clients wanted you drunk or drugged. They would buy you drinks, insist you finish them, keep ordering more. Sometimes this was simple hospitality, a way to make the transaction feel more social. Sometimes it was predatory, getting you impaired so you would agree to things you would normally refuse, or so you would be too confused to notice if they shorted you on payment. You learned to pace yourself, to pretend to drink more than you actually did, to stay just sober enough to protect yourself. Water between beers. Eating before drinking. Never accepting drinks from someone you did not trust. These were survival skills. Let us talk about the physical toll the work took on your body, beyond disease and injury. The chronic exhaustion was relentless. You worked late into the night, sometimes until dawn, then tried to sleep during the day, in a room that was never quiet, because the building was full of people coming and going. You were always tired, functioning on insufficient rest, your body never fully recovering before you had to work again. The malnutrition was slow and insidious. You ate when you had money, which meant your diet was erratic. A good night meant a hot meal, meat pie, fried fish, bread, and cheese. A bad night meant nothing, or penny buns that were mostly air. Your body was constantly depleting its reserves. You were too thin, your ribs visible, your face gaunt. Clients sometimes commented on it. Some found the starving urchin look appealing. Others told you to eat more, as if this had never occurred to you. The chronic pain was part of the job. Your knees hurt from kneeling on stone and brick. Your jaw ached from repetitive motion. Your back hurt from being bent over walls and furniture. Your rectum was frequently torn and bleeding, never healing completely before the next injury. You learned to work through pain, to dissociate from your body while it was being used, to treat yourself as a tool that needed maintenance, but whose discomfort was irrelevant. The cold was particularly brutal in winter. Working outside in November, December, January, your fingers would go numb. Your face would hurt from the wind. Your whole body would shake uncontrollably. You could not afford warm enough clothing for the weather. The coat you owned was threadbare. Your boots leaked. You had no gloves. After work, you would return to your unheated room and huddle under thin blankets trying to warm up, sometimes not succeeding for hours. The dental problems were universal among the poor. You brushed your teeth never. Toothbrushes and powder cost money you did not have. Your teeth ached constantly. Several were loose. One had broken off months ago, and the exposed nerve sent shooting pains through your jaw every time you ate or drank anything cold. You needed a dentist, but dentists cost money, and even if you could afford extraction, you could not afford to lose days of work recovering. Your hands were damaged from various work and fights, knuckles scarred, fingers that did not quite straighten anymore. Chronic swelling in your left wrist from when a client bent it back too far. Your feet had chilblains every winter, painful swelling and itching from repeated exposure to cold. You had scars on your back from a beating you took 2 years ago. You had a knife scar on your arm from a robbery attempt you barely escaped. Looking in a mirror was depressing. You were 23, but looked 30. The life had aged you, hollowed you out, marked you. You saw boys who had been beautiful when they started, and were haggard wrecks 2 years later. The work consumed you physically, used up your youth and vitality, and discarded you when nothing attractive remained. Let us talk about the moments of human connection that happened despite everything, the relationships that formed in the margins. There was a cafe near Covent Garden, a shabby place that stayed open late and served terrible coffee for a penny. It became an unofficial gathering spot for rent boys in the early morning hours after work finished. You went there sometimes, sat in the back, nursed your coffee, and were among people who understood. No one used real names. Everyone had street names, chosen or assigned. You were called Kit, though that was not your birth name. There was Angel and Sparrow and Red Tom and half a dozen others who came and went. You talked about the night's work in oblique terms, sharing information, warning each other about dangerous clients, laughing at the absurdities when you could find humor in them. These were not deep friendships. You did not share your histories or your dreams. But there was solidarity in shared experience. When Angel was arrested, A collection was taken up to pay for a lawyer, though it was not enough to help much. When Sparrow was beaten by a client and needed medical care, Red Tom knew a doctor who would see him cheap. When you were short on rent, someone lent you 2 shillings, no questions asked, and you paid it back when you could. There were also older men, not clients exactly, who orbited this world. A former rent boy named George who had somehow survived into his 40s and now worked as a porter at Covent Garden Market. He would buy you breakfast sometimes, tell you stories about how much worse things used to be, offer advice you did not ask for but sometimes needed. George was living proof that survival was possible, even if his survival looked bleak and lonely. There was a woman named Nell who ran a second-hand clothing shop and who never asked where rent boys got the items they occasionally sold to her. Jackets taken from clients, stolen goods, things found or scavenged. She paid fair prices and did not judge. When you needed warmer clothes for winter, she sold you a heavy wool coat for less than it was worth and told you to pay her when you could. These small kindnesses, given and received, were what kept you human. They reminded you that you were not completely alone, that there were others who saw you as something more than a commodity. There were also moments of unexpected tenderness with clients, though they were rare enough to be memorable. A client who hired you and then, instead of sex, simply wanted to talk. He was old, maybe 60, well-dressed and clearly wealthy. He took you to a private dining room at a hotel and bought you dinner, real food, multiple courses, better than anything you had eaten in months. He asked about your life, seemed genuinely interested in your answers, treated you like a person. At the end of the evening, he paid you 10 shillings and said, "You remind me of someone I knew once. Take care of yourself." You never saw him again. You always wondered who he had lost, who you reminded him of, what story lay behind that evening. Another client, a younger man, maybe 30, who cried after sex, not from shame, which was common, but from loneliness. "I am so tired of hiding," he said. "I am tired of lying to everyone, tired of pretending, tired of being alone with this." You did not know what to say. You were not trained as a confessor or a therapist. So you just sat with him while he cried, and that seemed to be enough. He paid you and thanked you and left, and you felt the weight of his sadness for days. These moments complicated the narrative you told yourself about the work. It was not just exploitation and survival. Sometimes it was also about human need, about people desperate for connection in a world that forbade it, about the ways that intimacy, even purchased, even brief, mattered to people who had no other way to access it. But you could not afford to dwell on this too much. Sympathy for clients made the work harder. It was easier to see them as transactions, to stay detached, to protect yourself emotionally, even when your body was being violated. Let us talk about religion, because Victorian England was saturated with it, and you could not escape it even when you wanted to. The churches were everywhere, and they all preached the same message. Sodomy was an abomination, homosexuals were sinners destined for hell, and the only salvation was repentance and celibacy. You heard this message constantly, absorbed it, internalized it even when you tried not to. Some rent boys remained religious despite everything. They believed they were sinning, believed they were damned, and suffered accordingly. They went to church on Sundays and confessed their sins and promised to do better, then went back to work on Monday because survival demanded it. They lived in constant spiritual torment, torn between economic necessity and religious guilt. You tried to maintain faith for a while. You prayed. You asked God for forgiveness, for strength, for a way out. But the prayers felt hollow, unanswered. If God loved you, why had He made you desire men? If God was merciful, why was your only option for survival a sin that condemned you to hell? The contradictions became unbearable. Eventually you stopped praying. You told yourself you did not believe anymore, that it was all superstition, that there was no God watching and judging. This was easier than believing in a God who hated you for existing. But religious trauma does not disappear just because you stop believing. You still felt the weight of condemnation, still heard the voices of preachers calling you depraved, still internalized the message that you were fundamentally wrong and broken. Leaving religion did not free you from its psychological damage. Some rent boys converted that trauma into rage. They mocked religion openly, blasphemed deliberately, performed sacrilege as an act of defiance. Frilly Freddie would sometimes dress in drag and perform mock sermons in the back rooms of pubs, preaching salvation through sodomy, making everyone laugh, but also making a point. If the church condemned you anyway, why not embrace your damnation? Others sought out alternative spiritualities. There were spiritualist movements, occult societies, groups that claimed to offer paths to enlightenment outside Christianity. Some of these groups were more accepting of sexual diversity, or at least less overtly condemnatory. You never got involved. It seemed like trading one delusion for another. But you knew boys who found comfort in seances and tarot cards and esoteric rituals. The fundamental question that haunted you was whether you were choosing sin or whether you had been created this way. Victorian Christianity insisted it was choice, that homosexuality was a deliberate rejection of God's natural order, that you could choose differently if you truly wanted to. But you had never chosen to desire men. You simply did. It was as fundamental to you as breathing. If this was how you were made, then either God made a mistake or God made you this way intentionally. If God made a mistake, he was not all-powerful. If he made you this way intentionally, then condemned you for it, he was not loving. Either way, the God of Victorian Christianity made no sense. Some modern writers and activists were beginning to argue that homosexuality was innate, biological, not a choice or a sin, but simply a variation in human sexuality. These ideas were radical and dangerous. The medical establishment mostly treated homosexuality as a mental illness or a degenerative condition, but they offered an alternative framework. You read whatever you could find, which was not much. Pamphlets circulated in secret, essays published on the continent, arguments that men like you were not criminals or sinners but simply different. These ideas gave you a vocabulary for your experience, a way to understand yourself outside the framework of sin and sickness. But they did not change your material reality. Whether you were a sinner or simply born this way, you still had to eat. You still had to pay rent. You still had to sell your body to survive. Philosophical frameworks were interesting but useless when you were cold and hungry. Let us talk about violence in more detail because it was everywhere and came from every direction. Client violence was the most common. Men who hit you during sex. Men who choked you until you nearly passed out. Men who wanted to hurt you and paid for the privilege. You developed strategies for managing this. You set boundaries before starting. Nothing above the neck, or no marks that show. Though these boundaries were frequently ignored once the act began. You learned to fight back when necessary, to protect yourself, even if it meant losing the client and the money. You carried a knife, a small one that fit in your pocket, and you had used it once, slashing a client's arm when he started strangling you. He let go. You ran. You never knew if he reported it or simply nursed his injury in silence. Street violence was random and frequent. Gangs of young men who roamed certain areas looking for poofs to beat up. They called it queer bashing, and it was considered sport. They would surround you, taunt you, then attack. Fists, boots, sometimes weapons. You were beaten 3 times in 2 years. Once you got away with bruises. Once you had 2 cracked ribs. Once you were knocked unconscious and woke up in an alley, missing your money and your shoes. The police were supposed to protect citizens from violence. In practice, they were often the perpetrators. Police officers beat suspects routinely, especially suspects they considered moral degenerates. If you were arrested, you expected to be roughed up at minimum. Resisting arrest, or being perceived as resisting, could mean severe injury. You witnessed police beat a rent boy named Simon so badly he lost hearing in one ear and had permanent brain damage. Simon had been caught in a public toilet, tried to run, and was tackled by two officers who beat him with their truncheons while he was on the ground. No charges were filed against the officers. Simon was convicted of gross indecency and sentenced to 2 years, which he served in prison, unable to fully understand where he was or why. Prison violence was systematic and brutal. Prisoners assaulted each other, guards assaulted prisoners, and men convicted of homosexual offences were particular targets. You heard stories from boys who had served time, beatings, sexual assault by other prisoners, or guards, being denied medical care, being put in solitary confinement for weeks as punishment for minor infractions. The violence was not just physical. The psychological violence of constant degradation, constant fear, constant surveillance took its own toll. You lived in a state of hypervigilance, always scanning for threats, always ready to fight or flee, never able to fully relax. This rewired your nervous system, left you jumpy and aggressive and unable to sleep soundly. There was also the violence you inflicted sometimes. You were not proud of this, but survival sometimes required it. You had fought other rent boys over territory or clients. You had punched a man who tried to rob you. You had once kicked a drunk client who became belligerent and refused to pay. Violence beget violence, and you were caught in the cycle. Let us talk about the rare moments of joy, because they existed even in this life. The first warm day of spring after a brutal winter, when you could work without freezing, when the world seemed slightly less hostile. The relief was physical, visceral, almost euphoric. A particularly large payment that meant you could take a night off, could buy a good meal, could sleep without worrying about tomorrow. You remember earning 15 shillings in one night, an unusually generous client who paid well and left quickly, and the sense of temporary security it provided. Laughter with other rent boys, usually dark humour about the absurdities of your situation, jokes about clients, about narrow escapes from police, about the ridiculousness of Victorian sexual morality. Laughing helped. It created distance from the horror, made it slightly more bearable. Music in the streets and pubs. London was full of music. Organ grinders, buskers, pub pianists, people singing. You had no money for concert halls or music halls, but you could listen to a street violinist for free, could sing along with a pub chorus, could absorb beauty in small stolen doses. The theatre, on the rare occasions when you could afford a gallery ticket. Sitting in the cheap seats, watching performers transform into other people, losing yourself in a story for 2 hours. The theatre was magical precisely because it was artificial, because it was everything your life was not. Colourful, dramatic, resolved. Small acts of defiance that felt like victories. Walking past a police officer and not being stopped. Negotiating a client up from 3 shillings to 5. Helping another rent boy avoid arrest. These tiny moments of agency and control in a life that offered very little of either. And sometimes, rarely, genuine desire. Most sex work was mechanical and unpleasant, but occasionally you found a client attractive. Occasionally your body responded with actual arousal instead of just going through motions. These moments were confusing. They blurred the line between work and want. But they reminded you that you were still capable of feeling pleasure, that your sexuality had not been completely destroyed by commodification. There was beauty too, in unexpected places. London was filthy and brutal, but it had moments of genuine loveliness that caught you off guard. The Thames at dawn, when the fog lifted and the water turned silver. You saw this after all-night shifts, walking home as the city woke up, the light hitting the bridges and the buildings in ways that made them look almost magical. For a few minutes you could forget what you had spent the night doing and just watch the sunrise, the flowers in Covent Garden Market. You passed through sometimes in early morning when the vendors were setting up, when the square was filled with roses and lilies and hothouse blooms. The smell was overwhelming after the usual stench of London streets. You never bought any. Flowers were an absurd luxury. But you looked, and the colours were vivid enough to imprint on your memory. The first snowfall of winter, before it turned to grey slush. Snow made London quiet, muffled the constant noise, covered the filth temporarily. You watched it fall from your window and felt something like peace, knowing it would not last, but appreciating it while it did. These moments did not redeem anything. They did not make your life acceptable or bearable or meaningful, but they punctuated the monotony of suffering with brief reminders that the world contained things beyond pain and transaction and survival. Let us talk about the fantasy lives you constructed, the futures you imagined when you let yourself hope. Every rent boy had a version of the same fantasy: escape. Getting out of London, starting over somewhere no one knew you, becoming someone respectable. The details varied, but the core was the same. You would stop doing this. You would be safe. You would be free. Your personal fantasy involved emigration to America. You had heard stories about New York, San Francisco, Chicago, cities larger and more anonymous than London, places where you could disappear into the crowds, where your past would not follow you. You imagined working an honest job. You were not picky about what anything legitimate would do. You imagined having a room of your own, nothing fancy but clean and private, and yours. You imagined not being afraid all the time. The fantasy required money you did not have. Passage to America cost several pounds, more than you had ever managed to save. And even if you could afford passage, you would arrive with nothing, knowing no one, possibly no better off than you were in London. But the fantasy persisted because you needed something to hold on to, some vision of a different life. Other boys had different dreams. Tommy wanted to join the theatre, to become an actor, to use his looks and his ability to perform for something other than prostitution. This was not entirely unrealistic. The theatre did employ working-class boys, and the boundary between theatrical performance and sexual commerce was porous. But Tommy was 20 now, aging out of the ingenue roles he might have played, and he had no training or connections. His dream was fading even as he clung to it. Jack wanted to fight professionally. He was built for it, strong and tough and good with his fists. He talked about becoming a boxer, earning money in the ring instead of on the streets. He even trained sometimes, sparring with other boys in makeshift gyms. But professional boxing required a manager, required entry into a world that was as corrupt and exploitative as prostitution in its own way. Jack was more likely to be used up and discarded by the fight game than to find success in it. Frilly Freddy had the most radical fantasy. He wanted to live as a woman, not just perform femininity for clients, but actually transition, wear women's clothes openly, take a female name, exist in the world as the person he felt himself to be. This was extraordinarily dangerous in Victorian England. Cross-dressing was illegal. The police arrested men in women's clothing regularly. But Freddie talked about it anyway, about someday having enough money to disappear and reinvent himself completely. You listened to these fantasies and shared your own, and everyone understood that they were mostly lies you told yourselves to make the present tolerable. But the fantasies mattered. They kept you going. They gave you something to work toward, even if you never actually arrived. Some boys abandoned fantasy entirely and lived purely in the present. They spent everything they earned immediately, on food, drink, clothes, entertainment, operating on the assumption that there was no future worth saving for. This made a certain nihilistic sense. Tomorrow, you might be arrested, might be killed, might contract a fatal disease. Why deny yourself today for a tomorrow that might never come? You tried to find a middle path. You spent what you needed to survive and occasionally to enjoy yourself. But you also tried to save small amounts, hiding coins in a tin under your floorboards. The savings never accumulated to much. Emergencies always depleted them. But the act of saving felt like resistance. like refusing to accept that this was all your life would ever be. Let us talk about literacy and education, because these were dividing lines in the world of prostitution. You could read and write, which put you ahead of many working-class Londoners. Your mother had taught you basic literacy before she died, and you had attended a ragged school sporadically as a child. This skill gave you options other boys did not have. You could read newspaper advertisements for employment, could write letters if you needed to, could navigate the city using street signs and posted notices. Some rent boys were completely illiterate. They could not read clients' notes, could not verify addresses, could not access written information. This made them more vulnerable to exploitation and deception. A client could write down an address, and they would have to trust it was correct. A contract or agreement could contain anything, and they would never know. There were boys who were educated beyond what their current situation suggested. Boys from middle-class families who had fallen into ruin through scandal or financial disaster. Boys who had been university students before being expelled for moral turpitude. These boys often struggled the most psychologically because they had known respectability and lost it. You met one named Edmund who had been studying theology at Oxford before being discovered in bed with another student. He was expelled in disgrace, disowned by his family, and ended up in London with nothing. He worked as a rent boy with the desperate air of someone who could not believe this was his life. He quoted Latin poetry to clients who did not understand it. He drank heavily. He killed himself in 1887, opium overdose, leaving a note that quoted Job, "Let the day perish wherein I was born." Education was supposed to be the path to social mobility in Victorian England. The myth was that intelligence and hard work could lift you out of poverty into respectability. But this was mostly a lie. Education required resources, time, money, access to schools and tutors. And even with education, opportunities were limited by class, connections, and respectability. Your literacy at least allowed you to follow the news, to understand the broader context of your situation. You read newspaper accounts of arrests and trials, learning which magistrates were most punitive, which areas of London were experiencing police sweeps. You read about the Cleveland Street scandal and understood its implications. You read editorials condemning homosexuality and felt the hatred directed at you personally. There were also underground publications, printed secretly and circulated carefully, that offered different perspectives. Pamphlets arguing for law reform, for decriminalization, for acceptance of sexual diversity. These were rare and dangerous to possess. Being caught with one could be evidence of your own deviance, but they circulated nonetheless. You read one pamphlet called A Problem in Greek Ethics that had been printed privately and smuggled from the continent. It argued that same-sex love had been accepted and celebrated in ancient Greece, that the current criminalization was a product of Christian morality rather than universal human nature. The argument was not entirely convincing. Victorian England was not ancient Athens, but it offered a different framework, a way to see yourself as part of a long history rather than as a modern aberration. These intellectual resources were fragmentary and inadequate, but they helped. They suggested that the Victorian consensus on homosexuality was not inevitable or natural, that it could be challenged and changed. This was cold comfort when you were cold and hungry and working the streets, but it planted seeds of political consciousness that would eventually grow into a movement for rights and recognition. Let us talk about the ages at which boys entered prostitution, because this ranged widely and the younger ones haunted you. The legal age of consent for boys did not exist in Victorian England. The age of consent for girls was raised to 16 in 1885, but there was no equivalent protection for boys. This meant that child prostitution was common and difficult to prosecute, unless it could be framed as corruption of a minor or procurement for sodomy. Boys entered the trade as young as 12 or 13, sometimes younger. These were children from the absolute bottom of society. Orphans, runaways, boys thrown out by families who could not feed them or who discovered their sexual proclivities. They had no other options. They starved or they sold themselves. The clients who sought out these very young boys were pedophiles. There is no other word for it. Victorian society preferred euphemisms, corruption of youth, or moral degeneracy. But the reality was that grown men were raping children and paying for the privilege. You tried to protect younger boys when you could. You taught them which clients to avoid, which police officers were most dangerous, where to find cheap food and shelter. You gave them money occasionally when you had extra, though you rarely had extra. You felt responsible for them in ways you could not quite articulate, as if by helping them, you were retroactively helping your younger self. There was a boy named Davy, who could not have been more than 14, small and thin and terrified. You found him crying in an alley after his first client had hurt him badly. You took him to the doctor you knew, paid for treatment, told him he could do something else, anything else. He looked at you with eyes older than his years and said, "Like what?" And you had no answer. Davy disappeared a few months later. You never found out what happened to him. Boys that young died frequently, violence, disease, suicide, accidents, or they aged into older rent boys and you simply stopped recognizing them. The turnover was constant. The Victorian child protection movement was beginning to pay attention to child prostitution, but primarily focused on girls. The campaigners found it easier to generate public sympathy for victimized girls than for boys, and they were deeply uncomfortable with homosexuality. Some reformers actively argued that boy prostitutes were more culpable than girl prostitutes because their acts were not just immoral, but unnatural. This meant that boys received less protection and less sympathy. When police raided brothels, they rescued girls and sent them to reformatories, but they arrested boys and sent them to prison. The double standard was absolute. You had been lucky, if luck was the right word. You had entered prostitution at 17, nearly an adult. You had made the choice yourself, such as it was, rather than being sold or coerced by an adult. But you knew boys who had been procured at 12 by adult pimps, who had been groomed and exploited, and had known nothing else. Their chances of survival were slim. Let us talk about the rituals and superstitions that developed, the small magics men used to cope with chaos. You had a lucky coin, a bent sixpence that a generous client had given you after your first week of work. You kept it separate from your earnings, touched it before going out each night. This was completely irrational. The coin had no power, but the ritual gave you a sense of control, a feeling that you were doing something to protect yourself. Other boys had their own superstitions. Tommy would not work on Sundays, convinced it was bad luck. Jack always approached clients from the left side. Frilly Freddie wore a particular scarf that he believed kept him safe from arrest. These were coping mechanisms, ways to impose pattern and meaning on randomness. There were also darker rituals. A rent boy named Michael practiced what he called sympathetic magic, drawing symbols on his body with ink before work, convinced they would ward off violence. When he was beaten nearly to death by a client, he concluded he had drawn the symbols incorrectly, not that the symbols were useless. The superstitions were not limited to protective magic. There were beliefs about which nights were most profitable, Fridays and Saturdays for obvious reasons, but also Tuesdays, for no reason anyone could explain. There were beliefs about weather. Rain drove clients indoors, but light mist brought them out. Full moons were either very good or very bad depending on who you asked. You developed your own internal calculus for reading the night ahead. If the first client paid well, the night would be good. If you saw 3 policemen on your way to work, you should be extra careful. If you heard church bells while negotiating with a client, the transaction would go smoothly. None of this made sense, but it gave you the illusion of being able to predict and control outcomes. Religion left traces even for those who had abandoned formal belief. You still crossed yourself sometimes when passing churches. You still felt uneasy about working on Christmas Eve. You still experienced Good Friday as somehow more dangerous than other days, as if divine judgment was particularly active. These superstitions were laughable from the outside, but from the inside they were essential. When you have no real power, no real security, no real control over your life. You invent control through ritual. It does not matter if it works. It matters that it gives you a framework for navigating uncertainty. Let us talk about the physical spaces where you actually lived, the rooms that were home such as they were. Your current room was in a lodging house on a narrow street in Clerkenwell. The building housed perhaps 20 people in 8 rooms, plus the landlady and her husband, who lived in the basement. Your room was on the 3rd floor, accessible by stairs that creaked and sagged dangerously. The room was roughly 10 feet by 8 feet. The ceiling was low enough that you could touch it without stretching. There was one small window that looked onto an air shaft, providing minimal light and no view. The wallpaper had once been patterned, but was now just stained and peeling. The floor was bare boards, with gaps wide enough to see through to the room below. Your furniture consisted of a narrow iron bedstead with a straw mattress, one wooden chair with a broken back slat, and a small table that wobbled. There was a washstand with a chipped basin and a chamber pot underneath. No wardrobe. Your few clothes hung from nails driven into the wall. No heating except what warmth leaked up from the floors below. You shared a privy in the backyard with everyone else in the building. It was a cesspit privy, basically a hole in the ground that was supposed to be emptied regularly, but never was. The smell in summer was overwhelming. In winter it froze, which created different problems. There was one water pump in the yard for the entire building. You fetched water in a bucket when you needed it. The rent was 4 shillings a week, paid in advance every Monday morning. If you were late, the landlady would lock you out and rent the room to someone else within hours. There was always someone desperate enough to take it. You had lived in worse places. You had lived in a cellar room that flooded whenever it rained, where you woke up in water and your belongings rotted from damp. You had lived in a room you shared with 3 other boys, sleeping in shifts because there were only 2 beds. You had lived in a common lodging house dormitory, where 40 men slept in one room and theft was constant. The current room was yours alone, and that privacy was worth the extra cost. You could come and go without explaining yourself. You could cry or scream or simply sit in silence without an audience. You could hide your savings without worrying someone would find them immediately. The room was miserable, but it was yours. You tried to make it slightly less grim. You had acquired a candle holder, 2 tin cups, a better blanket than the one that came with the bed. You kept the space as clean as you could, sweeping the floor, wiping down surfaces. It was a losing battle against London dirt and the building's general decay, but you fought it anyway. The walls were thin. You heard everything that happened in adjacent rooms and the corridor. Fights, sex, crying, prayers, all of it bled through. The man in the next room coughed constantly, a wet, tubercular cough that suggested he would not last long. The woman upstairs argued with her husband nightly, their voices rising to shouts and sometimes crashes. You learned to ignore most of it, to create mental privacy when physical privacy was impossible. You learned to sleep through noise, to think through chaos, to maintain some internal space that was yours alone. The building itself was slowly falling apart. The roof leaked. The stairs were dangerous. The rats were numerous and bold. The landlady made minimal repairs, just enough to keep the building rentable, but no more. The entire structure felt temporary, like it could collapse or burn down at any moment. Fire was a real and constant fear. The buildings in this part of London were old, wooden, packed close together. Candles and oil lamps were the only light sources. Fires started regularly, and when they did, they spread fast. You had an escape route planned, out the window onto the neighbouring roof if the stairs were blocked, but you knew that most fire victims died of smoke inhalation before they could escape. The neighbourhood itself was rough. Clerkenwell was a working-class area with high poverty and high crime. Pickpockets, burglars, muggers, all operated openly. You walked quickly at night, stayed alert, carried your knife. The local police were corrupt and brutal, more dangerous than helpful. But the neighbourhood also had a certain tolerance. People minded their own business. No one asked too many questions about how you earned your living. The local shopkeepers sold you goods without judgment. The pub landlords served you without comment. You were part of the underclass, the invisible London that polite society pretended did not exist. Let us talk about food in more detail, because hunger was a constant presence. On a good week you ate twice a day. On a bad week you ate when you could, which might be once a day or less. Your diet was monotonous and nutritionally inadequate. Bread, cheese, potatoes, cheap cuts of meat when you could afford them, tea, beer. Street food was your primary source of hot meals. Meat pies from vendors who sold them for tuppence, filled with mystery meat that was probably mostly gristle and organs. Fried fish wrapped in newspaper. Baked potatoes sold from carts, cheap and filling, if not exciting. Soup from cookshops, watery but hot. The quality ranged from acceptable to actively dangerous. Food poisoning was common. Meat spoiled quickly without refrigeration, and vendors sold it anyway. Milk was often watered down or contaminated. Bread was sometimes adulterated with chalk or alum to make it look whiter. You got sick from food several times, spent days vomiting and unable to work, and had no choice but to eat the same things again when you recovered. Coffee stalls operated all night in areas where you worked. Terrible coffee in chipped cups. But it was hot and it was a penny, and sometimes that was enough. You stood at these stalls in the early morning hours, warming your hands on the cup, eavesdropping on other customers' conversations, delaying your return to the cold room. There were charitable soup kitchens and food distribution programs, but accessing them required admitting destitution and often enduring religious lectures. Some charities required attendance at services in exchange for food. Some asked invasive questions about your circumstances. You avoided them when possible, took their food when necessary, and resented the condescension that came with every bowl of soup. Hunger did strange things to your mind. It made you obsessed with food, unable to think about anything else. It made you weak and dizzy and unable to work effectively. It made you desperate enough to take risks you would otherwise avoid. Dangerous clients who paid well, theft when opportunities presented themselves. You stole food sometimes, fruit from market stalls, bread from bakeries, anything you could take without being caught. This was risky. Theft convictions could mean prison or even transportation to Australia. But hunger overrode caution. You justified it by telling yourself that the food would be wasted anyway, that vendors expected a certain amount of theft, that survival was more important than morality. The gap between how you ate and how wealthy Londoners ate was obscene. You read newspaper descriptions of banquets, of multi-course dinners that wasted more food than you ate in a week. The wealthy complained about indigestion from overeating while you went to bed hungry. The injustice of it was staggering, but what could you do? The system was designed to produce exactly this outcome. Some rent boys developed relationships with restaurant workers or hotel kitchen staff who would give them leftover food, day-old bread, scraps from wealthy diners' plates, food that would otherwise be discarded. This required cultivating friendships, offering favors, building networks. You did this when you could, though it was unpredictable. The few times you had enough money to eat properly, to go to a cheap restaurant and order a full meal, were memorable. Roast beef and potatoes, or mutton stew with bread, eaten slowly while sitting at an actual table. The temporary satisfaction of a full stomach, the brief illusion of normalcy. These moments were rare enough that you remembered each one. Let us talk about the concept of respectability, that central Victorian obsession that shaped everything. Respectability was the dividing line between those who mattered and those who did not. It determined who received charity, who received justice, who received basic human consideration. And it was defined primarily through sexual morality, through conformity to rigid gender and sexual norms. You were by definition outside respectability. Your work, your desires, your very existence violated everything Victorian society valued. This exclusion was total. You could not become respectable through hard work or good behavior or moral improvement. Your past disqualified you permanently. This created a strange freedom. If you were already condemned, already excluded, what did you have to lose? Some rent boys leaned into this, performing outrageous femininity or public sexual bravado, refusing to pretend shame. If society offered you no path to redemption, why perform contrition? But the loss of respectability also meant loss of protection. Respectable people could appeal to police, to courts, to public sympathy when wronged. You could not. If a client robbed you, you had no recourse. If a landlord cheated you, you could not complain. If you were assaulted, reporting it meant exposing yourself to arrest. The police explicitly operated differently depending on the perceived respectability of victims. A respectable woman assaulted on the street would trigger immediate investigation. A prostitute assaulted would be ignored or blamed. A rent boy assaulted would likely be arrested himself. This created a permanent underclass of people who existed outside the law's protection while remaining subject to its punishments. You could be arrested for violating laws but could not use law to protect yourself. The asymmetry was designed to maintain social hierarchies. Some rent boys tried desperately to maintain some shred of respectability, keeping their work secret from neighbors or distant family members, maintaining respectable clothing and manners in public. This was exhausting and usually futile. Neighbors noticed when you came home at dawn. Landladies figured out what you did. The signs were obvious to anyone paying attention. You had given up on respectability. It was a game you could not win, so you stopped playing. This was liberating in some ways. You no longer had to perform normalcy or hide fundamental parts of yourself. But it also meant accepting permanent exile from the world that contained security, opportunity, recognition. The Victorian middle class was obsessed with drawing boundaries, with distinguishing themselves from the working class below and the aristocracy above. Rent boys existed so far outside these boundaries that you were almost invisible. Respectable people passed you on the street and literally did not see you, looked through you as if you were not there. This invisibility was protective sometimes. If they did not see you, they did not interfere with you. But it was also dehumanizing, a constant reminder that you did not matter, that your life and death and suffering were irrelevant to the people who shaped society. Victorian respectability was built on a foundation of hypocrisy so vast it would be funny if it were not so deadly. The same society that criminalized you created the conditions that ensured you existed. Poverty produced prostitution. The criminalization of homosexuality created a market for secret encounters. The rigid sexual morality that forbade premarital sex and extramarital affairs drove men to purchase what they could not obtain legitimately. The system manufactured its own outcasts and then condemned them for existing. The clients who used your services were often the most vocal defenders of public morality. They sat on charitable boards, they attended church, they supported laws criminalizing the very acts they paid to commit. Their respectability was purchased through your degradation. They maintained their position in society by using and then discarding people like you. You understood this intellectually, but understanding did not make it easier to bear. Every transaction was a reminder of your expendability, of the fundamental inequality that structured every interaction. The client went home to his wife and children and respectable life. You went home to a freezing room and the knowledge that tomorrow you would do this again. As the months turned to years, you felt yourself changing in ways you could not quite articulate. You were harder than you had been at 17, less shocked by cruelty, less surprised by betrayal, less capable of hope. You had seen too much, endured too much, survived too much. The softness that might have grown into something else in a different life had been beaten out of you by necessity. But you were also more observant, more strategic, more skilled at reading people and situations. You knew within 30 seconds whether a client was dangerous. You could negotiate prices with cold precision. You could disappear into a crowd when police appeared. These were survival skills, earned through brutal experience. You wondered sometimes what you might have become in a different world. If you had been born wealthy, or straight, or in a different era,
What life might you have lived? The question was pointless, but you asked it anyway. Usually late at night, when sleep would not come, and the weight of everything pressed down too heavily. There were boys who broke completely, who lost themselves to drink or drugs or madness. You had stayed sane mostly, though you were not sure if that was strength or simply not having been pushed far enough yet. The breaking point was different for everyone. You had not found yours yet. You hoped you never would. The broader world was changing, slowly, in ways you could sense but not quite see. There were whispers of reform movements on the continent, of scientists and doctors and activists arguing for different understandings of homosexuality. There were writers publishing defences of same-sex love, though their work was banned in England. There was a growing awareness, at least among some educated people, that the current approach was not working and possibly not justified. But these changes were abstract, distant, irrelevant to your immediate survival. What did it matter if some German doctor argued that homosexuality was congenital rather than chosen? That would not keep you warm tonight. That would not pay your rent tomorrow. That would not protect you from the next violent client or the next police sweep. Still, the whispers mattered. They suggested that the Victorian consensus was not eternal, that different futures were possible. You would probably not live to see them. You had no illusions about your life expectancy. But maybe boys coming after you would. Maybe someday men who loved men could exist without fear, could build lives beyond survival, could be something other than criminals and outcasts. It was a thin thread of hope, but you held it anyway. Let us talk about what all of this meant, about what it reveals about Victorian London and about human survival. You were part of a hidden London, a shadow city that existed alongside and underneath the respectable world. Thousands of men selling sex, thousands more buying it, an entire economy of desire and desperation that everyone knew about and no one acknowledged. The Victorians were very good at not seeing what contradicted their self-image. Your existence proved that sexuality could not be legislated away. The laws against homosexuality did not eliminate homosexual desire. They simply drove it underground, made it more dangerous, created suffering without achieving their supposed goals. The same pattern would repeat throughout history. Prohibition creating black markets, criminalization creating victims, moral panics producing exactly the outcomes they claimed to prevent. The way Victorian society treated rent boys revealed everything about its actual values. It claimed to care about public morality, but created systems that ensured young men would be driven to prostitution. It claimed to value human life, but treated whole classes of people as disposable. It claimed to be Christian, but showed no mercy to the vulnerable. You were not a victim in the simple sense. You had agency, you made choices, you survived through intelligence and will. But your choices were constrained by circumstances you did not create. You did what you had to do to eat, to survive, to maintain some shred of autonomy in a world designed to crush people like you. The rent boys of Victorian London were human beings who loved and suffered and hoped and despaired. They were not statistics or moral lessons or cautionary tales. They were people navigating impossible circumstances, creating community in the margins, finding moments of beauty and connection, even in brutality. Most of their names are lost. Most of their stories died with them. The few fragments that survive, court records, newspaper accounts, private letters, medical reports, offer only glimpses, but those glimpses are enough to know that they existed, that they mattered, that their lives had meaning, even when the society around them denied it. So, tonight, as you lie in your comfortable bed with its clean sheets and central heating, in a world where being gay is no longer a criminal act in most places, where you can love who you love without automatic exile from society, spare a thought for the boys who worked the arcades of Piccadilly. Think about the teenagers who sold themselves to survive in a city that wanted them erased. Think about the men who built lives in the margins, who created community despite everything, who endured horrors we can barely imagine. Think about the ones who died young and forgotten, whose names we will never know, who deserved so much better than what they received. Their suffering bought us something, though they did not intend it, and received no benefit themselves. Every arrest, every trial, every public scandal slowly eroded the Victorian consensus. Every person who survived despite everything proved that you could not legislate away fundamental human desires. Every small act of resistance, every moment of community, every refusal to feel ashamed contributed to changes they would never see. We live in the world their suffering helped create, a world that is still unjust but slightly less so, still dangerous but slightly less deadly. We owe them memory, we owe them recognition, we owe them the acknowledgement that they existed, that they mattered, that their lives were not shameful secrets, but human stories worth telling. The Victorian rent boy who worked the streets until he could not anymore, who died in a workhouse or a prison or a freezing room, who left no trace except perhaps a line in a police ledger. He was a person. He had thoughts and feelings and dreams and fears. He loved even when love was forbidden. He survived as long as he could. He deserves to be remembered. So as you drift off tonight, warm and safe and free to be whoever you are, let his ghost sit with you for a moment. Let yourself feel the weight of what he endured so that he could simply exist. Let yourself be grateful for the distance between his world and yours, while remembering that distance was built on the backs of people who paid prices you will never have to pay. May your dreams be free of gaslit alleys and desperate transactions, of police raids and prison cells, of hunger and cold, and the exhausting work of staying alive when the world wants you dead. And may you wake tomorrow with some understanding of what it cost for us to arrive at a present that is still imperfect, but no longer requires that particular sacrifice. Good night, and sleep well, and sleep.